Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Cohen, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
I'm excited to have you. So we have J. Alexander Cohen with us today. He's here to talk about his book, Talio. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Talio's Codex.
Talio's Codex. And it's described very interestingly as a space wizard science fantasy. Tell me about that.
That is the name of the publisher.
Okay.
Yeah, so they publish all sorts of stuff. Mostly, I think it's all queer, gay stuff, but so a combination between science fiction and fantasy and what have you, and that was the name they took on a few years ago, which I think is pretty memorable too.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking that was the genre you were fitting into.
Oh, no, I'd say mine is fantasy legal thriller.
Fantasy legal thriller. So tell us about your setting, your characters. Introduce us to this world.
Sure. So it's a world, if you can imagine, sort of like a medieval Dutch Venetian world. Canals. They worship water. That is the primary religion of worshiping a water god. There are rivers in the sky that connect four cities. And the main character was once a magistrate, a judge, until a scandal cost him his job, his marriage, everything. He went off to become a scavenger for 10 years. And 10 years later, his ex-wife says, "Could you come back and defend one of my students in a murder charge?" And so he does and starts getting his career back on track, only to discover that there's sort of a conspiracy in the background that has to do with why he lost his job the first time around. So something that I thought you might be interested in, because I know you have a legal background, is there's a big discussion of intellectual property.
Oh, okay.
Because their legal system is only 50 years old and they don't have any concept of intellectual property yet. So, and that's one of the subplots, is them working on the idea of like, what is intellectual property? What should be protected? Why should it be protected? And so, yeah, I mean, I thought you would be interested because I know.
That is an interesting spin on fantasy and in that setting. What type of technology do they have? You said it's medieval, so
Yeah, medieval, like 1700s, I'd say. They have things like boats or whatever, but no energy source beyond the magical mineral that produces the water that creates those rivers that fly through the sky. But
okay.
aside from that, it's pretty primitive.
Okay. And do people have magic? Are people magical or people are just people?
People used to have magic. There was a whole group of mages that sort of rebelled, and then they all had to be taken care of and trapped in this forest that's between the four cities. But that was 50 years ago.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Does that come back into the plot or is that giving too much away?
Maybe in a few books from now.
Okay.
That's so.
So this is the first in a series then.
Hopefully, I really am hopeful. The publisher has asked me to create a sequel, and I need to get it to them by the end of the year.
Wow, that's a tight timeline.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it for about a year anyways. They accepted the novel just about a year ago. So I've had a chance to already think about the sequel. But yeah, I thought it would be a perfect thing, courtroom drama, legal thriller, and then mix that in with fantasy and sort of historical setting and something that hadn't been done all that much before to date.
Right. And how were you drawn to the legal thriller aspect?
Well, I went to law school.
Oh, okay.
Early 90s. I was never called to the bar, never practiced, but I worked in legal publishing for many years after that. And I always thought it was like, I have all this knowledge and I've never put it to use. And I thought, wow, this is not only that, but all those happy memories of law school too, where a lot of that came into thing. Like, do you remember the thing where you had to always buy a new copy of the book, even if there were 100 used copies on?
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I mentioned in there because I do remember that even after 30 years. I mean, anyways, but yeah, I always found law really fascinating, and I guess I wanted to practice intellectual property law.
Oh, interesting.
Unfortunately, in the early 90s, it was just before the internet took off, and the vast majority of intellectual property law was scientific, so chemistry, biology. And if you didn't have that undergrad degree in it, they weren't looking. And I didn't realize that at the time. Nowadays, I think it would be a lot different because of the technology aspect, software and what have you. But back then, it was pretty strict and pretty limited. So
Oh,
I thought
interesting.
there, I
Yeah.
thought intellectual property, and then I got to third year and I was like, oh, okay, I should have probably researched this a bit more closely.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a registered patent agent, so I didn't go to law school, but all the I can't imagine going to law school plus getting your master's or your PhD. That's a lot of school. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it was great to be able to, and it's funny that I remembered all that stuff too, or a lot of it. Fortunately, it's their own legal system, so it doesn't have to perfectly match our own, and it actually doesn't. There are a few reasons that it doesn't match our own, but yeah, close enough that people can follow along without, just like they might watch Law and Order or Suits or whatever and enjoy that sort of stuff without having a law degree.
Yeah, I got the opportunity to be on a jury a couple of months ago, and that was an interesting experience for me to learn more about the court system and really see it in action. So that was really cool.
I'm still waiting. I'm 56 now, and I'm still waiting to be called for jury duty. And fascinating. I would love to see it.
It was interesting, definitely. So tell me a little more about your character. So your character is gay, is that correct?
Yep. Well,
And is there a
bisexual,
romance
I guess.
component to the story as well?
Yes, he sort of he's choosing between this one guy who's very handsome, who's the crown prosecutor, and who happened to be the one that caused him to lose his job 10 years previously. On the one hand, and on the other hand, it's a guy who's part of this religious minority that wears a cloak and a hood all the time. All the time. They can never be seen, not even when they're in bed.
Oh, wow.
They don't wear the cloak and hood to bed, but I'm saying total darkness or something like that. So, yeah, so he's sort of this other guy who's very bitter about the religious discrimination and is a lawyer as well, and the handsome guy. And the main character also has a facial scar as well. So there's a lot to do with appearance and sort of the masks we put on and what it's like to live in a society when you look different, and how it affects you internally, how it affects you if you're part of a religious minority. So I know that sounds all like very super heavy topics, but it's also a lot of courtroom fun too. So
Well, I was going to say, I feel like fantasy is a good way to explore some of those issues and topics in a way that helps you think about them maybe in a safer space almost.
yeah, definitely. The religious minority sort of is a stand-in, I guess you could say, for any of our minorities. But the nice thing is that reading it, I don't think anybody would be like, hey, whoa, you're criticizing me or whatever. It's like, I'm starting to feel anxious here. It's like, no, it's sort of this thought experiment that's going on. Like, what's it like when a religious minority is simply in opposition to everything of the mainstream? They believe in a fire god instead of a water god. They live in a society that's obsessed with authentication, identification, and they refuse to show their faces. So they have hand tattoos and they have identity keys. But aside from that, and so, you think, and so I guess it turned out to be a social justice type of book, but in a sort of non-threatening way, because you're not saying to people, hey, look, you're not doing this for this particular minority. It's this imaginary group that you can see what they go through and see how it is if you're more in the mainstream, or I think we all are in a way. We all have some sort of minority aspect to us for the most part. There's some illness or gender presentation, sexual orientation, or whatever background. And so I think we can all identify with that. I think, like, at one point or another, we've all been the minority in the room. even if only once. I remember being the only guy who was hearing in a room full of deaf guys that were playing board games. And yeah, so for that moment, you get that sense of like, ah, I see, that must be what it's like the other way around.
And I
Just
can't
that.
talk to anyone now, right?
Well, I mean, I could do the finger spelling with my hand.
Okay.
Aside from that, they can sign incredibly quickly. So
But could you read it that quickly?
I could not, but we managed to get by.
And so it is an adult fantasy. What PG level? I went to your website and I was really impressed with like the amount of content you had about what type of book and what issues came up in your book and what not themes, but so what PG rating would you call it? Is this an R book? Is this a PG-13 book?
I'd say PG-13, a couple of open door sex scenes, but there's nothing that's described in, oh, I'd say everything, yeah, PG-13 to R. Let's put it that way.
And you said you were in legal publishing. When did you switch to fiction writing?
Well, I was always interested in fiction writing, even as a kid. My dad had an old typewriter, manual typewriter, and I went in and I would type in things like from Peanuts and Snoopy on it. And then my parents would think I was a brilliant writer. And I had to tell them, no, this is actually from a comic or whatever. But I always wanted to write. I always wanted to write short stories. I always wanted to write fiction. But you can't make a living at it unless you're one of those bestsellers. And so business and then law. And then I guess I switched over to more marketing and business writing. I always thought that legal publishing and legal writing, being a lawyer, would be about doing breakthroughs, making changes to the law and whatever. And fact of the matter is, most of it is adhering to the law and precedents and what have you. So that was another misunderstanding that I had, too much watching TV and reading books about the law instead of really. So I started in the late 90s, I guess, writing more seriously fiction. Had my first book published in 2003. And then I sort of took a 20-year break to do some family caregiving, which is still ongoing, but now I have a bit more time. So my father fell ill in 2003 with the beginning of what became dementia and then Alzheimer's dementia. So I was helping mom out with that, and now I'm helping mom out. So but finally, I guess the thing with dad, it sort of took up a lot of mental space, and it was hard for me to get down to writing or whatever. And now that things are a little lighter, I felt that I could finally go back to it. And I finally could.
Creative avenue opened up again.
Exactly. I mean, we only have so many years, so I think it's important to, I mean, that's one of the things that I always tell people when they say they'd like to write something, whatever, is please do. Yeah, please do. It's like, you don't want to get to the end of your life and think, oh, I should have done that. It might not work out, but even so, the fact that you tried and that you could say, look, I made the effort here and I went after something that, I mean, you talk about finding the magic a lot. And, I think that's really, really important, is to go for it and to, life is hard, but that it's at least worth the effort to go after what you dream.
Yeah, I love that sentiment. And yes, I'm all about that. And I really try to write characters as well that realize they have whatever special attribute or whatever passion they have, and that they can use it to make a difference. Whatever aspect of their life they're doing that, whether they're helping a cat out of a tree or changing a law to be more inclusive. There's all levels of that. It's interesting that you said that about, you thought you were going to go into law to change things, because one path I love science and biology, and I thought I was going to be in environmental law, and I was always glad that I didn't go into that, because I really had that idealistic notion of, I'm going to save the planet, and I think it would have ended up being more frustrating for me than being in I started in research. So
yeah, I was a member of a group of environmental law, like at law school, student group.
Okay.
Yeah, even back then, what was the early 90s, so it was just when sort of that wave of environmentalism was hitting. And yeah, exactly. You could see how frustrating it was even back then. Back then, it was things like clear cutting and the Amazon were the big issues, like 90, 91 or whatever. And yeah, you were up against a monolithic forces of industry and capitalism that were very, very hard to fight against. And I mean, now I guess we're seeing the end result of that.
So tell me about your character and where he's going to go. Can you tell us more? I don't want to give too much away, but can you tell us more where he's heading in this series?
Well, in the first book, as I said, it's all about him coming back, coming to terms with sort of he's been a blind believer in the legal system, even though it resulted in him getting kicked out or whatever, and rebuilding his law firm and getting tied up with this religious minority. And then later on, I guess you could say it's a book about progress and about change, that their society starts changing very quickly due to a number of innovations, inventions, discoveries, and what have you, and how a society with the royalty, with the houses of nobles, and a very hidebound legal system has to face these things very quickly. And in many cases where they simply don't want to, where they want to hold back the tide. And as I have a line in the next book where he says something like, when it is time for the tide to come in, you can put up all the breakwaters and dams you want, but the tide will come in. So.
That's an interesting analogy to, I mean, I guess throughout society and history, we've had a lot of changes due to technology. I mean, right now it's AI. I mean, I can remember, in the 90s, it was cloning, so, and I'm sure at one point it was electricity and all those other things that have been, the web when it first kind of came out and is as dangerous to people. And so.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard. It is hard when the society and when legal systems aren't set up to deal with that. And then, you struggle with the idea of like, how fast can you turn to change it, to deal with something. You can see how people are struggling with AI now, and the fact that our society isn't set up for something where you can pump out hundreds of thousands of pages of copy, within a couple of days and simply spam everything. We're not ready for that. We're not ready for a world where you can imitate somebody else completely, which is coming, deep fake videos and that sort of thing, like where you can pick up the phone and hear somebody that you think is somebody you care about saying, I'm in trouble, I need money. And then you think, how do we get, that's one of the reasons why I found authentication identification so interesting, but how do we get from there to a place where, okay, we don't simply ban the technology because at this point it's too late.
Right.
I can run a small AI model on my computer at home, so it is way too late to do. But how do you get there to the point where it's safe again? And will it ever be safe again? So yeah, I mean, I think we're facing probably the biggest rate of technological change that any society ever has so far. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of stay standing.
Okay, and what is your character's name again?
Talio. Talio
It's
Rosa.
Talia's Codex, sorry. That was not a good moment for me.
Oh, that's okay.
So what do you think he's going to be facing in the second book then?
Medical stuff, medical legal. That was definitely the very first thing that I wanted to do, and I already had the idea. The guy that he's in love with develops a lump on his neck, and their medical treatment is very primitive because the mages used to do it all, and then they were all killed. So there is a possibility that a faith healer might have a solution, and he can't figure out how he's doing what he's doing. And at the same time, another character wants to have his father, who is basically in a coma, to be withdrawn from life support. And again, there is nothing in the law to say that. So
Interesting, but how is he on life support when they don't have electricity? So are they breathing for him physically like 24/7?
No, I mean, they turn him, they feed him, they give him
Okay.
whatever, but I was using the term life support. But basically the hospital is taking very, very good care of him. But unfortunately, that means that he's lingering on. And
Right. Okay.
so,
So not
so
the level of we think of life support, but he can't feed himself and
um,
people have to do things for him, which when you have that type of society usually doesn't happen, right? They just let people go.
well, I mean, unless they were willing to pay for it, that's the thing. If the patient's willing to pay, then I mean, in a sense, that's sort of what we have that a lot of, I mean, sorry, I'm in Canada. So things like retirement homes and whatever, if you can afford to pay for it, you are expected to. And then if you can't, then there are sort of free programs where you can be in one. So
Okay.
yeah. So I imagine that will be an interesting thing because I'm not sort of fighting one way or the other on behalf of or against of euthanasia, definitely. But I thought it would be an interesting issue because it was something that was discussed in the first book.
Right. Okay. So yeah, and you're approaching all those from your main character's legal background, and I mean, not only does law come in that, but do ethical issues come up too with the characters?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the idea is, where the character's son is basically, or the guy's son is basically, this must be torture for him. And Talia says, he looks fine. He doesn't look like he's in any pain or anything like that. And then, it's like, who are you doing this for? Are you doing this for yourself as the caregiver? Or are you doing this on behalf of somebody who no longer necessarily feels and thinks? Again, it makes it sound so super heavy, and that isn't necessarily. So there's humor and comedy in there too. So
I think I did see on your website that you have happily ever afters. So
yes, well, that's one thing. Again, growing up and reading the gay fiction of the day, a lot of the stuff had unhappy endings. A lot of the old stuff had unhappy endings too. They couldn't be together. One of the characters would kill themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And I decided long ago that I didn't want that. I mean, I've had a couple of short stories, I think, where there were unhappy endings, but in terms of novels, no. As I said before, life's hard enough. Let's enjoy. And I think you must agree the same from what I've seen on your website with your books. I
right,
mean,
definitely always a happily ever after.
yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
That's interesting that you said there. I mean, I guess in normal literature too, there are lots of books that are not happily ever after. But I just don't tend to read them. So, yeah.
what my favorite is when just before the ending, it looks like everything's a disaster and it's horrible and you've lost everything, and then there's a happy.
Yes,
That is my
definitely.
favorite, and it's very hard to do. Very hard to pull that swerve out without the reader suspecting that there's something else going on.
Yeah, I mean, well, if the reader knows it's going to be happy, I mean, if they know your books and they know what you usually do, they probably suspect you're going to pull it out some way. And I'm hoping that they just think, how are they going to pull this out, right?
Exactly, exactly. In a way that's fair to the reader.
Fair and logical and is not just like completely out of left field. Yeah,
Exactly. So,
I wrote my first ever fake high. I guess I call them like fake highs and fake lows. So, like you said, the darkest night, you know, you think all is lost in your plot point and then you pull them out, right? But I wrote my first ever, you think everything's gonna go right, and then it doesn't. And I still end up with a happily ever after at the very end, but I wrote my first story about you think everything's right, which was weird for me. I was like, oh, this feels strange. So I don't know if you follow some of those too.
yeah, I love twists. I really do. And they're so hard because with mass media and everything, I think we're so used to expecting twists nowadays that, a lot of times I'm sure it happens to you. You read a book, you see a movie, and you can spot the twist that's coming. This person is really the bad guy, the bad woman, or whatever. I mean, we're so used to it by now, and it's really hard to pull off a good twist that makes somebody, the last time I think I a twist was an old Agatha Christie book, where I was listening to it on audiobook driving down somewhere, and I was like, I literally couldn't believe it. I everything at that moment was recontextualized. that basically the group of people you'd been following from the beginning that you thought were the heroes and heroines were the villains. And the sort of anonymous council of evil was actually led by the police chief, who was the good guy. And so it's just, you're like, what? That's the sort of twist that I like.
Right.
It's
You
impossible.
have just like a little bit of hint that it makes it logical at the end, but not something you like really noticed, right?
Exactly. And that's one of the things, sort of putting the red herrings in and directing the reader away from what they should be looking at.
Fun. And I also saw on your website, you call your book a cozy fantasy. Can you explain more about that?
I'd say, yeah, and then I'd say more cozy adjacent fantasy.
Cozy adjacent fantasy, right?
Yeah. Well, cozy fantasy is sort of a new trend. I don't know if you've heard of legends and lattes.
No. Well, I know cozy mystery, so I was likening it to that.
Yeah, it's very similar. The idea is that, again, there's a happy ending. It's very gentle, low stakes, pleasant to read. It's like curling up in a blanket and reading that. So originally I called my stuff that because it was mostly talking in courtroom scenes and whatever. And then I realized actually it's a little more heavy duty than that. So that's why I said cozy adjacent. Like when I think of cozy and then non-cozy fantasy, I always think with other types of fantasy, sometimes you get this sort of sense of dread that something bad is going to happen, or you're always worrying that something's going to happen. And in a cozy fantasy, that really shouldn't be the case. That you should be, yeah, again, curled up in a blanket with a cat next to you and feeling great about it and whatever. My stuff's a little more hardcore than that. But again, knowing that there's a happily ever after and that somebody isn't going to simply come along and cause mass hysteria or whatever. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, you did describe, I mean, they're adults and they have these big issues and stumbling blocks in your life. So just to like push them under the rug and be like, everything's fine would be a little
yeah,
nonsensical, right?
exactly. But plus the fact that there are a lot of issues that I talk about that are simply not resolvable. People have different views on, whether like the idea of what type of sentencing is most appropriate. Should people be punished? Should people be allowed to make up for the things that they did? Should sentencing be harsh but fair? I mean, that's one example. So there's no obvious answer. I mean, our society has picked one, but I mean, I know a lot of people out there who think that sentencing should be punishment. That when somebody's done something wrong, they should be punished for it. And that's fair, but that's not something that I can convince them of otherwise. I can only sort of show the other options and then let them make the decisions themselves.
And sometimes, I mean, characters are going to disagree and there's not going to be an answer or resolution to, I mean, I guess there in the law or punishment, there would be some resolution, but in people's minds, sometimes that's not going to change. So
yeah, that's true. I mean, on the whole, I'd say I'm for what would be called today social justice, inclusiveness and acceptedness, trying to accommodate people, trying to get people together, but with the understanding that that's really hard. And in some cases, as I mentioned in the book, even though when you have people with mindsets that are different and they can't be mushed together, they simply can't, because my mindset is not the same as the other, and we are in hopefully not violent, but we are in strong opposition. And that's a tough one.
that is, yeah. So would you call your character the hero type? Does he save the day at the end, or is it more soft hero?
I'd say he's more of a very morally gray hero. He's very willing to do whatever is necessary, do stuff that's very much on the edge of legality, or pull tricks in the courtroom, or lie, or what have you, in the search of what he considers to be the right thing. So he's quite willing to go against what society thinks to. So heroic in his own mind, heroic in other people's minds, maybe not so much.
Interesting. I feel like hero stories if you think about a typical hero story, right? I mean, there's an obvious bad guy who can't be seen any other way. And then, but, well, I shouldn't say obviously again, that it sounds like there are many more issues coming up here that are gray than black and white.
Pretty much all the characters are very gray and very flawed in one way or another, which makes it a lot more fun.
Right. I love it. And you said you're finishing up your second book. Do you know what the name of your second book is going to be?
At the moment, Talia Rosa and the Elixir of Life.
Neat. And why did you name Talio's Codex? Where does the Codex play in that?
I had a lot of problems. And I went through a lot of different names for this one. As a magistrate, every magistrate in the story is given a codex, which is a list of laws and sentences, and it is considered to be a near holy book. And the night that he cheated on his wife with another man, he lost his codex. And that was one of the reasons that he lost his job, his career, his reputation, everything. And the codex is also key to sort of understanding the conspiracy that's going on in the background. So yeah, that was the best thing that I could come up with. There were all sorts of the ones that never quite hit it, but the publisher agreed.
Well, no, I like it. And I'm guessing that the normal person isn't supposed to know what's in the codex, like the general society. Only the judges are supposed to know what is in there.
Yes, the sentencing guidelines, actually.
Okay.
You look at everything else in the library, but the sentencing guidelines are for the magistrates only, for whatever reason.
And I'm guessing somebody stole this, so then that's another mystery within the story too.
That is revealed much later in the story too.
Okay, fun. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to dive into the book, and I think a lot of other readers will be too. Tell us where we can find your books and how we can read or listen to them.
Okay, well, Amazon is probably the best place for ebook there. You can also order the paperback, and pretty much every other online store that I know of, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all of those ones should have it as well. So if you search for Talio's Codex, I don't think there's anything else that has that, or go to my website,jalexandercohen.com, then you can find the info and get it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here and talking about your book. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And please come back when you publish your second book.
Thanks so much. I will.
Have a good day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.